My name is Harold Deansmore. I am 82 years old, and I live alone in the old clapboard house on the edge of McAllister County, Georgia. A house that once stood proud in the heart of a working cattle ranch, but now crouches like an aging dog waiting to be put down. The barn collapsed 5 years ago during a storm. The fence line is overgrown with honeysuckle and bitter weed, and the pastures lie dormant, untouched, unplowed, unwalked. Some days I sit on the porch in my battered rocker and watch the wind roll through the dry grass, imagining what it looked like when Ellen was alive and our son still called this place home. I wasn't always alone. Ellen and I were married for 58 years. She had a way of softening the rough edges in me. She'd laugh and say I had a voice like gravel and a heart like melted butter, though I think most people only saw the gravel. We raised one son, Charles, who turned out smart, driven, and ambitious to a fault. He left the ranch at 18 and never looked back. Real estate, he said. Big money in it. He was always chasing something bigger than the soil and cattle and sweat that built this place. For years, I held on to the hope that he'd come around, realize that there's value in what your father built with his own 2 hands, but the years stacked up like unpaid bills, and his visits became fewer, his calls shorter, and his affection more. Performative. Ellen kept trying to make peace between us. She said I expected too much from a modern man. She told me Charles wasn't cold, just different. But I saw the calculation in his eyes every time he walked through our door with that practiced grin and that air of impatience like our lives were a detour from something important he needed to get back to. He brought his wife, Melanie, one Christmas, and she stayed exactly long enough to make a scene about the guest room not having an ensuite bathroom. That was the year I stopped decorating the big tree. Just a few lights on the porch after that. When Ellen got sick, Charles visited twice, once with Melanie, once alone. He stayed all of 3 hours each time. I remember the second visit clearer than most days. She was lying in the bedroom, thin and pale, her hands like curled paper. He came in with a briefcase and a stack of legal documents. "Just making things easier for when it's time," he said. That's when I knew he was already thinking past her. I didn't sign anything. Neither did she. I never brought it up again, and neither did he. Ellen passed in early spring. The morning air still had bite to it, and I remember she asked for the window to be cracked so she could smell the dew on the red clover before the sun dried it up. She went quietly without fear or spectacle, just one slow exhale and a calm expression I hadn't seen in years. I sat with her for an hour before I called anyone. Just me, her, and the ticking of the grandfather clock that my father once wound every Sunday after church. The funeral was small, like she wanted. Closed casket, no flowers except the ones from the garden she used to tend behind the kitchen. A few neighbors came, mostly folks who remembered her from church or from the farmer's market. Charles came, of course. He wore black like a uniform and shook hands like a man running for office. At the graveside, just after the preacher said his final words, Charles leaned in close, his breath hot with the tang of cologne and something bitter, and he whispered, "You're next." Then he smiled and kissed me on the cheek like a good son, and I stood there, stunned, while the coffin descended into the earth. I didn't say anything. Not then. I didn't trust my voice. Or maybe I was afraid that if I opened my mouth something inside me would break loose and never go back. That whisper clawed at me all night, all through the silence of the house, through the creaks and groans of a place that once held laughter and now echoed with memory. I sat in Ellen's chair and stared out the window until morning. "You're next." 4 syllables. Meant to unsettle, meant to warn, or maybe just meant to remind me that I was, in his eyes, nothing but the last obstacle between him and whatever he wanted. The next morning, he came to the house with coffee and donuts, smiling like nothing had happened. Said he wanted to go over a few practicalities, while we were both still thinking clearly. That's the phrase he used. Thinking clearly. He always had a way of turning concern into something that sounded like a compliment but felt like a diagnosis. I played along, poured coffee, listened politely, nodded at the right moments. Inside, I felt the slow churn of something I hadn't let myself feel in decades. Not since the war. Not since I watched a friend bleed out in my arms and realized the world doesn't care how kind you are. It only cares what it can take. Charles talked for an hour. About probate, about property value, about estate taxes. He used words like streamlining and transition planning. He mentioned a retirement facility in Savannah, showed me brochures like it was a travel catalog, described the community garden and water aerobics like I was some faded photo from an AARP. Assistant. I asked him if he planned to move in with me to take care of things, to be a son again, even if just for a while. He laughed, not cruelly, just dismissively, like I'd suggested he take up clog dancing. "No, Dad," he said. "I've got my own responsibilities." That's when I knew I was truly alone. Not just in the physical sense. Not just in the way a widower finds himself talking to chairs or saving half a sandwich out of habit. I was alone in the way a man becomes irrelevant to the people he raised. Alone in the sense that no one remembers the things you built unless there's money to be made from dismantling them. Charles didn't come to grieve. He came to assess the timeline, and when he whispered those words at the grave, "You're next," he wasn't mourning a mother. He was counting down the days to opportunity. I should have said something, confronted him, demanded an explanation. But at my age, you start to pick your battles more carefully. You begin to understand that some wars are fought not with weapons or words, but with time and silence, and the slow, methodical refusal to surrender what's left of your dignity. So I let him sit in my kitchen, talking about elder care and power of attorney forms, and I waited to see what kind of man my son had truly become. Waited to learn just how far he was willing to go to make sure I wouldn't be around to get in his way. And in that waiting, I began to plan. Quietly, patiently, and with the kind of clarity that only comes when you realize that love, real, hard-earned love, isn't just about giving. Sometimes it's about refusing to be taken from, piece by piece, memory by memory, until all that remains of you is a signature on a line and a whisper in the dirt. The morning after Ellen's funeral, the sky hung low and colorless, as if the world itself had paused in grief. I hadn't slept. My hands still smelled faintly of her lavender lotion from the night before, when I brushed her hair one last time before the undertaker took her away. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost in my own house, making coffee I couldn't taste, staring at photos that didn't speak back. The silence pressed in from every side. There was no clink of dishes from the sink, no creak of her footsteps down the hall, no hum of her voice reading the newspaper aloud to me while I pretended not to listen. The house was hollow in a way that wasn't architectural. It was spiritual. The absence of her voice made the walls thinner, the floorboards colder, the ceilings impossibly high. Around 9 a.m., I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I knew it was Charles before I looked. Nobody else drove a black Cadillac Escalade with custom rims in this part of Georgia. It was the kind of vehicle that made statements just by arriving. He stepped out of the car in a charcoal gray suit, sunglasses even though the sun was nowhere to be found. Melanie wasn't with him, which felt both suspicious and, in some strange way, a relief. He didn't knock. Just let himself in like he still had that right. I was at the table, cup in hand, though I'd stopped drinking an hour ago. He nodded toward the empty chair across from me like a man proposing a business merger. "I brought donuts," he said, placing a white box on the counter. "Thought we could talk." I didn't answer. He sat down anyway and began opening the box with the same precision I once saw him use as a boy dissecting a frog for school. Detached, efficient, bored. He pulled out a glazed ring and set it in front of me like an offering. I stared at it, wondering how many times he had sat in that same seat, eating cereal and asking questions about cows and tractors and why the sky turned pink in the evening. It felt like 1,000 lifetimes ago. Charles laced his fingers together on the table and leaned in. "Look, Dad, I know it's a rough time, and I don't want to add to your stress, but there are some things we need to get in order. Just practical stuff." I waited. He always started this way, a slow warm-up before the swing of the axe. "You're alone now," he continued as if that were a newsflash. "And the ranch. Well, it's too much for one person. I've spoken to a few folks, and with the market the way it is, you could make a decent sale. Good money, maybe even enough to move into something comfortable." He pulled a brochure from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. I didn't touch it. On the cover was a picture of smiling seniors holding hands by a koi pond. The words, "Savannah Glen Independent Living Community," were printed in cursive font, cheerful and deadly. "It's a good place," he said. "Safe, clean. Full staff, meals included. They have an activities calendar. You'd have neighbors, people your age to talk to." "And what would you do with the ranch?" I asked, my voice sounding older than I remembered. He didn't hesitate. "Develop it. Subdivide it into lots. There's real demand for custom homes around here. Families moving out from the city. You'd be helping the area grow." "Helping you grow your commission," I muttered. He smiled, that same rehearsed smile that never quite touched his eyes. "Look, we can both win. You get comfort and care, and I handle the logistics. I've already spoken to a notary. We just need your signature to move things along." I stared at him for a long time. His eyes were clear, focused, hungry. There was no grief in him. Not for Ellen, not for me. Just ambition wrapped in concern. Entitlement disguised as care. "Do you remember what you whispered to me yesterday?" I asked. He blinked, feigned confusion. "At the funeral?" "Yes." He shifted in his seat. "I said I'd always be here for you." "No, Charles. You said, 'You're next.'" The air went still. He exhaled slowly, deliberately, the way a lawyer might when preparing to cross-examine a witness who's gone off script. "You must have misheard," he said softly. "It was a long day. Emotions were high." "I didn't mishear." He leaned back in his chair, his posture changing subtly. Less son, more strategist. "Look, if you want to get into semantics, fine. But we both know what comes next, right? You're not getting younger. You're not as sharp as you used to be. I'm just trying to help before something bad happens." "Like what?" I asked. "Like forgetting to turn off the stove? Like falling and no one finding you for days? Like winding up in a hospital with no one to advocate for you? This isn't a threat, Dad. It's a reality check. I'm offering a path forward, with dignity." I stared down at my hands. They were old hands. Wrinkled, liver-spotted, thick-knuckled. But they were still steady. Still strong. They had buried fence posts, delivered calves, and held Ellen as she drew her final breath. They weren't ready to sign away their legacy. Charles stood up. "I'm leaving these here," he said, gesturing to the documents. "Think about it. I'll be back in a couple of days." He left the donuts, too. Of course he did. Sweetness to cover the bitterness. As the screen door creaked shut behind him, I looked again at the brochure. The people on the cover were laughing, their faces lit with forced joy. They didn't look like me. They didn't look like Ellen. They looked like prisoners in a pastel-painted minimum security life sentence. The house was quiet again, too quiet, but now it pulsed with something else. Not grief, not nostalgia, something harder, sharper, the beginnings of resolve. He thought I'd go quietly, sign the papers, sell the land, shuffle off into some beige apartment where my only job would be to stay out of the way until death finally made good on his whisper. But I wasn't dead yet. And if Charles wanted a war, he was about to learn that old men don't always go down easy. Some of us remember how to fight in the dirt. Some of us are just waiting for a reason. And now, I had mine. The following days unfolded in a strange haze of domestic routine and subtle dread. I fed the dogs, fixed myself breakfast, trimmed the rose bushes in the backyard where Ellen used to plant basil and sunflowers in the spring. And yet, beneath every small motion there pulsed a persistent unease, a crawling tension that settled in the base of my neck and would not leave. Charles didn't call, didn't show up, and for a while I let myself believe, however foolishly, that maybe he had come to his senses. Maybe the funeral had stirred something deeper in him. Maybe grief had twisted his words, and I had misjudged him. I even found myself walking past the brochures on the kitchen counter without throwing them away, though every fiber in me wanted to burn them. Instead, I left them there like evidence in case I needed reminding that my instincts weren't lies. It was 3 days later when he came back. I saw the Cadillac from the living room window, saw the glint of its polished hood slicing through the gravel like a blade. This time, he brought Melanie. She emerged from the car in high-heeled boots and a thin cardigan despite the early spring chill, holding her phone in one hand, tapping at the screen with perfectly manicured fingers. They entered without knocking again, walking through the door like they still owned a part of this house, or worse, like they already believed it was theirs. Charles gave me a clipped smile. Melanie didn't bother. "Morning, Dad," he said briskly, as though he were arriving for a scheduled meeting. "Hope we're not interrupting anything." "You are," I replied, folding the newspaper I hadn't really been reading. Charles ignored that. Melanie walked around the living room, her eyes scanning the furniture like an appraiser. "This couch," she said aloud, "is practically antique. Might be worth something at auction if cleaned up." "I'm not dead yet," I muttered. Melanie blinked at me, clearly unbothered. "Of course not. Just thinking ahead." They moved to the kitchen, spreading papers across the table again, this time with more confidence. The deed to the land, a stack of pre-filled forms, something from a bank. Charles had even brought a pen. He tapped it against the countertop like a gavel. "Dad, we've made a few adjustments since our last conversation. The buyer I mentioned is still interested, but we need to move quickly. The market's hot right now. We're lucky to get this price." I stared at the documents, saying nothing. He tapped the pen again. "You sign these," he said. "We get you moved into Savannah Glen by next weekend and you can relax. No more worrying about taxes, repairs, mowing lawns. It's a win-win." Melanie chimed in. "You'll love it there, Mr. Deansmore. They have shuffleboard tournaments and garden clubs. You can even take art classes. We toured it ourselves last month. It's adorable." I looked up at them both, feeling the temperature in the room drop despite the spring sunlight filtering through the window. "You toured it yourselves?" She smiled like I had just asked the silliest question in the world. "Of course. We needed to make sure it was appropriate. Can't have you tripping over uneven floorboards, right?" Charles exhaled, growing impatient. "Dad, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're 82. You shouldn't be climbing stairs or changing light bulbs or—" "I served in Korea, Charles," I said evenly. "I changed tank belts under enemy fire. I rebuilt this house with my bare hands after the '89 flood. If I fall on my own ground." He paused, lips tight, then sat down slowly. "This isn't about pride. This is about safety, about legacy, about what's best for everyone." "No," I said, voice hardening. "This is about convenience. Yours." He blinked, surprised. Melanie glanced at Charles, raising an eyebrow as if to say, "Well, that's not in the script." "You're not doing this for me," I continued. "You're doing this because you want the land. You've already promised it to someone, haven't you?" Charles opened his mouth, but Melanie beat him to it. "That's absurd." "Is it?" I stood, walked over to the cabinet, and pulled out the drawer where Ellen kept the checkbooks. Inside was a letter, one she'd written just weeks before her death. I handed it to Charles. "I found this in her writing desk," I said. "Go on, read it." He took the paper reluctantly. I watched his face as he scanned it, his eyes narrowing, jaw tightening. He folded it quickly and placed it back on the table like it burned his fingers. "She was confused," he muttered. "No," I said. "She wasn't. She was scared. She saw this coming, and now I see it too." Melanie laughed softly, a dry, disdainful sound. "Okay, so what? You think we're plotting to... what? Steal your life out from under you? I think you already started." The silence stretched, thick as honey. Finally, Charles broke it. "You really want this to turn into a fight?" "It already is." He gathered the papers with jerky motions, shoving them into his briefcase. "Fine, but don't come crawling to me when you fall and break your hip. Don't expect Melanie and me to drop everything and come running." "You never did," I said. They left in silence. This time, they slammed the door behind them. It rattled the frame, sent dust motes spiraling into the sunlit air. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, heart hammering like I'd just fought off an intruder. That night, I locked every window. I turned off the lights, sat in the dark with only Ellen's quilt across my knees and my old dog beside me. Outside, the wind whispered across the empty fields, and for the first time in years, I felt something that was not sadness, not nostalgia, not fear. It was fury, quiet, measured, cold. The kind of fury that builds slowly, one humiliation at a time, until it has weight and direction. I knew then that this wasn't just about land. This was about identity, about legacy, about refusing to be erased by the very people you spent your life building a future for. Charles wasn't just trying to take the ranch. He was trying to rewrite the ending of my story. And I wasn't going to let him. It was exactly 1 week after their second visit that I discovered the house listed for sale online. I was sitting in my den, the room that still smelled faintly of Ellen's rosewater perfume and wood smoke from winters long gone, trying to order replacement parts for the broken hinge on the porch door, when I decided to search for lumber suppliers. But instead of finishing that task, I idly typed the ranch's address into the search bar out of some morbid curiosity, a quiet itch that had been growing ever since Charles walked out that last time. What loaded first was not a supplier's registry or an old zoning document, but a real estate page. There it was, a full-color listing of my home, with 12 professionally taken photographs showing every angle of the house, the yard, even the tool shed I hadn't cleaned in months. The asking price was bold and optimistic. The description, written in that bright, hollow marketing tone, spoke of Southern charm, ample redevelopment potential, and ideal investment for discerning buyers. I sat there, blinking at the screen, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be true. I had not signed anything. I had not agreed to a sale, or even a showing. And yet the photos were recent. The cushions on the porch swing were fluffed. The vase on the dining table was filled with sunflowers, fake ones, probably from the dollar store, but arranged to mimic a life lived in peace and warmth. I hadn't seen them before. That meant someone had been inside. That meant they had entered my home, my private, grief-ridden, crumbling sanctuary, and staged it for public consumption without my knowledge or consent. And worse, they had done it with such confidence, such unflinching entitlement, that they hadn't even bothered to hide the evidence. I printed the listing. I held the paper in my hand like it was a court summons, or maybe a confession. Then I made a phone call I hadn't made in almost a decade. Martin Keyes was an old friend from my veterans group and a retired estate attorney who still took the occasional case when it involved old men like me, whom the world had decided to forget. I hadn't seen him in years, not since Ellen's 75th birthday party, but when I told him who I was and what had happened, he said only, "Come in. Bring everything." His office was small and smelled like lemon oil and stale coffee. He wore a beige cardigan and wire-rimmed glasses that kept slipping down his nose. He listened while I told the story, read the printed real estate listing, and then silently examined a folder I had brought containing the old deed to the ranch, a copy of Ellen's will, and a packet of documents Charles had left during his first visit. "Well," Martin said at last, tapping a pen against the folder, "this is going to get messy." He explained calmly and patiently that if I hadn't signed anything, and if Ellen's will named me as sole inheritor, as it clearly did, then Charles had no right to list the property. Not legally. But the documents he left me, Martin unfolded them now and pointed to the fine print, were cleverly disguised. One was a power of attorney form, pre-filled, where my signature line had been left blank. Another was a document authorizing transfer of estate property under joint oversight. In plain terms, it was meaningless without a signature. But if someone forged that signature and acted fast enough, the damage could be immense. I felt nausea crawl up my throat. Martin looked at me closely. "Have you checked your bank accounts lately?" I had not. He nodded grimly. "You should." When I got home, I logged in and found 3 pending transactions I didn't recognize. One was a wire transfer request for $25,000 marked Estate Liquidation Services. Another was a charge from a medical testing service I had never used. And the third, still pending, was an application to refinance the ranch. I stared at the numbers, stunned, and suddenly remembered that Charles had once convinced me to give him online access to the joint emergency account I'd opened decades ago, just in case anything ever happened to Mom. I'd forgotten all about it. The betrayal hit me harder than I thought it would. Not because it was unexpected. I think deep down I'd always feared Charles would cross a line, but because he'd done it so quickly, so casually, like I was just another item on a checklist. Funeral, sell ranch, liquidate accounts, institutionalize the old man. It wasn't a long con. It was efficient, ruthless, modern. That night, I stood in Ellen's old closet. It still smelled like her. Linen, lavender, and the faint lingering trace of her favorite vanilla powder. I sat on the edge of the bed and held one of her shawls in my hands, letting the fabric slip through my fingers like time. I wished she were there. Not to fix it, just to tell me I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't wrong to feel violated, that I had every right to be angry. I went to the county clerk's office the next morning, requested copies of any newly filed documents related to the ranch. The clerk, a soft-spoken woman in her 30s, frowned as she typed. "There's a transfer of interest form here," she said, "but it hasn't been processed yet. It's flagged for signature verification." I asked if I could see it. She printed a copy and handed it to me. My signature was at the bottom. Crooked, hesitant, almost childlike. It wasn't mine. But someone had tried to make it look like mine. Sloppily. I left with the copy in hand and drove directly back to Martin's office. He studied it, compared it to my actual signature on other documents, and nodded. "We can contest this, immediately. But you need to act now." "What do I do?" I asked. "You authorize me to represent you. We file for a freeze on all related accounts and property, and we prepare for a possible injunction." It felt like I was walking into a war. But unlike Korea, this one wasn't fought with bullets and sandbags. This one would be fought in quiet rooms with quiet men and forged papers, with legalese and bank logs and the grim determination of a father who finally understood that his own son saw him not as a man, but as a stepping stone. I signed the authorization. Martin began the paperwork. On the way home, I pulled into the church parking lot just for a moment. I sat there and watched the wind move through the cemetery trees. I looked toward the place where we buried Ellen and imagined her lying beneath the soft Georgia soil, far from the noise, far from betrayal, her hands finally still. "I'm sorry, Ellie," I whispered, but only for not seeing it sooner. The week that followed was unlike any I'd lived through in all my years, And I say that as a man who'd survived wartime, drought, and the slow dying of a spouse. But what Charles had done, what he was doing, was something altogether different. It wasn't sudden and brutal like battle or long and mournful like illness. It was clinical. It was orchestrated. It was theft in a silk tie and leather loafers, masked by words like strategy and logistics. And the most galling part was that he truly seemed to believe he was entitled to it all, not just the land or the house, but the very story of who I had been and what I had built. Martin had filed the emergency injunction the day after we discovered the forged transfer attempt. It froze the title on the property and blocked any further financial activity tied to my estate. The court accepted our claim for signature fraud, and an investigation was formally opened. That should have been the end of it, or at least a pause. But Charles was already 2 moves ahead. The morning after the injunction, I received a visit from a woman who introduced herself as Jennifer Crane, an elder care liaison contracted by the county. She had glossy hair, an expensive coat, and the clipped tone of someone who used protocol as both excuse and command. She held a clipboard and a polite but firm smile. "Mr. Deansmore," she said, "we received a report from your son regarding concerns about your cognitive capacity. We're here to perform a wellness check." I stared at her. "A what?" She held up a form I couldn't quite read through the screen door. Standard operating procedure when a report is filed. Nothing invasive. Just a few questions to ensure your safety and autonomy. I didn't let her in. I told her to wait on the porch, went inside, and called Martin. "They're trying to build a case," he said immediately. "If they can prove you're not competent, they can challenge everything. The injunction, the will, your right to contest the transfer." "Can they do that?" He hesitated. "They can try. But you'll need documentation, doctor's assessments, cognitive evaluations. We'll need to get ahead of this." I returned to the porch and told Miss Crane that any further inquiries would go through my attorney. She left me a business card with a tight smile and a hint of warning in her eyes, like someone who thinks they've just seen the beginning of a slow unraveling. I stood there a long time after she left, staring at the spot where her SUV had been. Then I looked down at the porch floorboards, weathered and gray, and thought about how many years my hands had spent hammering, sanding, painting, preserving this place, not just for me, but for a legacy I foolishly assumed would be honored. The next day, I went to the clinic. I requested a full cognitive screening, told them exactly what it was for, and insisted on a formal, notarized result. The nurse, a kind woman named Rosita who'd known Ellen from church, patted my shoulder and said, "You don't need a piece of paper to prove you're all there, Mr. Deansmore, but we'll get you one anyway." The tests took 2 hours. Memory, language, problem-solving, spatial awareness. I passed every section. The neurologist, Dr. Madden, even chuckled at one point and said, "You've got a sharper memory than most of my residents." I took the report straight to Martin. "This is gold," he said, scanning the results. "We'll file it with the court. If they try to challenge your capacity, they'll have a hell of a time now." I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt exhausted, because I knew Charles wouldn't stop there. And I was right. 2 days later, a man in a suit knocked on my door. Process server. He handed me a folder and said, "I'm sorry, sir. This one's personal." Inside were papers filed by Charles's attorney. A formal petition to appoint him as my legal guardian. The motion cited concerns of declining mental faculties, recent isolation, and financial mismanagement. Attached were 3 statements. One from Melanie, one from a family doctor I hadn't seen in 7 years, and one anonymous neighbor who claimed I'd been seen wandering at night in my pajamas, confused and muttering. It was all lies, but it was dressed up in official language and filed with a county seal. I took the folder back to Martin. "We're going to fight this," he said calmly. and we're going to win. The hearing was scheduled for 10 days out. Until then, everything was on pause. I wasn't allowed to make major financial decisions. I couldn't sell the house or modify the will. Charles, it seemed, had found the one way to paralyze me, at least temporarily. That evening, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea and the weight of a dozen betrayals pressing into my chest, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I stood up slowly, bracing myself for what I somehow already knew. It was Charles. Alone, this time. He got out of the car like a man who owned the ground beneath him. He didn't knock. He opened the screen door and stood in the doorway, looking around like he was already taking inventory. "You really went nuclear," he said, not even waiting for a greeting. "Filing injunctions, freezing the listing, dragging lawyers into this. I'm protecting what's mine." He smirked. "You mean what's going to be mine? Eventually." "You're just making it harder. You forged my signature. I did what needed to be done. You tried to declare me incompetent." "Because you are," he snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "Look, Dad, you're not thinking clearly. You're letting some two-bit lawyer fill your head with drama. You're not seeing the bigger picture." "I see it perfectly." He walked into the living room without being invited, looked around. "This place is falling apart. You're living in a mausoleum. And for what? Sentiment? You think Mom would want this? You don't get to speak for her." He ignored that, sat on the arm of the couch like a casual guest. This could have gone smooth. But now, you've got the county involved, you've got paperwork flying back and forth, and you're going to drain whatever savings you've got left on legal fees just to die alone in a drafty house no one visits. I'd rather die alone here than live. Surrounded by liars, Charles stood up, suddenly angry. "I gave you options. I gave you dignity. You gave me deadlines. You're stubborn. You always were. You treated me like a farmhand, not a son. You never trusted me. I wanted to trust you. I waited for a reason to. And now you have one. Too little. Too late." He walked to the door, paused. "You can still fix this. Drop the injunction. Sign the papers. We walk away clean." "I'm not signing anything." He stared at me, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not just greed or resentment, but something colder. Calculation. He wasn't angry. He was mapping his next move. "You always said you wanted peace," he said. "Let's see how much you really meant it." Then he left. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, listening to the echo of tires retreating down the gravel drive. I knew that wasn't the end. I knew the worst was still ahead. But for the first time since Ellen died, I felt something other than sorrow. I felt prepared. The morning of the hearing arrived with a sky the color of wet ash and an air thick with the kind of heavy stillness that always comes before a storm. I woke early, though I'd barely slept the night before. My body moved through the rituals, shaving, dressing, buttoning up a clean shirt with stiff fingers, but my thoughts were somewhere else entirely. This wasn't just a legal proceeding. This was the crucible, the moment that would define whether I was still a man in the eyes of the world, or just a fragile body to be managed and maneuvered out of the way. Martin met me at the courthouse, his satchel packed with every document we'd gathered, every test result, every notarized signature. He looked calm, but I could see the tightness in his jaw. The readiness of a man who had fought enough battles to know that even the truth has to be weaponized if it's going to survive a courtroom. We entered the hearing room, which was small and sunless, lit by fluorescents and filled with an uncomfortable silence that no one dared break. Charles was already there, seated with his attorney, a sharp-jawed man in a pinstripe suit who looked like he had never worked a day in the sun. Charles didn't meet my eyes. He looked straight ahead, his expression composed, but his fingers drumming nervously on the polished table. His suit was new, maybe tailored. He looked the part of a concerned son. I wondered how long he'd practiced the face. I took my seat beside Martin and clasped my hands in my lap. The judge entered, a middle-aged woman with a firm voice and eyes that missed nothing. She greeted the room with procedural courtesy, then turned to Charles's lawyer. "We'll begin with the petition," she said. And so it began. Charles's attorney launched into a carefully rehearsed argument that his client had acted out of concern, that recent behavioral reports suggested cognitive decline, that I had allegedly made erratic financial decisions, such as withdrawing large sums of cash and rejecting safe housing alternatives. He even referred to the medical documents, the one signed by that long-retired doctor I hadn't seen since Bush was in office, implying a history of confusion. Then came the statements, Melanie's, full of exaggerated concern and anecdotes of imagined slips in memory, the neighbors, conveniently anonymous, and finally a sworn affidavit from Charles himself, describing in excruciating detail my supposed paranoia, my refusal to accept logical planning, and the emotional distress I had allegedly caused him by resisting care. When they finished, the judge looked at me. "Mr. Deansmore, do you have a response?" I stood slowly. Martin had warned me not to be emotional, not to let my voice shake or my fists clench. But I was past emotion. I had aged out of fear. I spoke calmly, clearly, the way I had when I used to explain weather patterns to young farmhands or walk county commissioners through fencing ordinances. I explained what had really happened: the forged signature, the unauthorized listing of my property, the unsolicited medical forms, the attempted bank withdrawals. I provided the notarized results from the neurologist. I handed over the report from the clinic. I read from Ellen's letter, not the sentimental parts, but the lines where she said she feared our son's ambition more than her illness. I could see something shift in the judge's eyes when I said those words. Martin presented the rest: the bank records, the title freeze, the inconsistencies in the affidavits, the contradictions between what Charles claimed and what documents proved. It was precise, relentless, and quietly damning. When we finished, the room sat in silence for a long moment. Then the judge turned back to Charles. "You attempted to have your father declared legally incompetent," she said, her voice sharp, "based on doctored documents, unsigned claims, and hearsay. You also attempted to sell his property without consent, and initiated financial transactions from an account that, while technically joint, had not been touched by you in years. Can you explain any of this?" Charles stood, adjusting his tie. "My father is a proud man," he began. "He wouldn't admit it if he were struggling. This is not about pride," the judge interrupted. "This is about control, and the lengths you've gone to obtain it." She paused, her gaze cold. "Petition denied." The words hit the room like a dropped stone. I exhaled. Slowly. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I let my shoulders relax. Martin gave me a small nod but said nothing. He didn't need to. The battle had been won, but the war was still smoldering in the wreckage between me and my son. Outside the courthouse, the sky had begun to clear. The air smelled like wet leaves and distant rain. Charles came out a few minutes later, alone. His lawyer had left quickly, his face stiff with professional disappointment. I turned to go, but Charles caught up. "You think this is over?" he said, his voice low. "It is," I replied without looking at him. "You humiliated me." "No," I said. "You did that to yourself." He grabbed my arm, not roughly, but with force. "You'll die alone." "I already have," I said quietly. "The moment you looked at me and saw a bank account instead of a father." His grip loosened. I stepped away. He stood there on the courthouse steps, a man who had gambled everything on the idea that his father was too old, too tired, too alone to fight back. And he'd lost. I walked away. I didn't look back. Later that evening, as I sat in the den with a blanket over my knees and Ellen's shawl folded neatly beside me, I allowed myself a moment, not of triumph, but of clarity. I had not won a fortune, not protected some vast empire. I had simply preserved my right to be the man I had always been, to live in the home I had built, to age on my own terms. And in doing so, I had drawn a line that Charles would never be able to cross again. It has been 6 months since the hearing, and the world, in its quiet way, has returned to a rhythm that feels almost familiar. The seasons have turned again. The garden out back is overrun with weeds, but also, unexpectedly, a patch of wild daisies I never planted. The dogs still bark at passing trucks, the floorboards still creak under my steps, and the house, though older and emptier than before, seems to have accepted my continued presence like an old companion resigned to my stubbornness. I no longer expect visitors. The mailbox is sparse now, mostly utility bills and veterans' newsletters, the occasional flyer for siding repair. Charles hasn't called. Not once. And for the first time in years, I have stopped expecting that he will. A month after the court decision, I received a notice from the county zoning office. The development company Charles had been dealing with had withdrawn their offer. Word must have gotten around about the legal dispute, or maybe they simply realized that dealing with a seasoned old man who'd taken his son to court wasn't worth the trouble. Either way, the house is no longer listed, and the ranch is once again invisible to everyone but me and the birds who nest along the fence posts. I walk the perimeter now every few days, not because I have to, but because it feels right to put my boots in the soil, to remind the land that I'm still here. Melanie filed for divorce shortly after the hearing. A friend from town told me she'd left Charles and taken their youngest daughter with her. I don't know what the final straw was. Maybe the public humiliation, maybe something older and quieter that had been growing in her for years. But either way, she left. Charles, from what little I hear, has moved back into the condo they bought downtown during their first wave of success. He's under investigation for client misrepresentation, though nothing formal has landed yet. His face no longer appears in real estate ads. I suspect quietly that he is broke, or close to it. I do not rejoice in it. I do not pity him either. I feel something closer to silence, a kind of emotional neutrality that settles in after the worst has passed and there's simply no more room left for noise. A letter arrived last week. It was postmarked from Raleigh, North Carolina, and addressed in a neat but unfamiliar hand. Inside was a folded piece of stationery, no return address, no preamble. Just a few lines written in a young woman's script. I'm your granddaughter. He never told me much about you, but I wanted to find out for myself. I'm sorry for what he did. I hope we can meet someday. M. There was no phone number, just an email address scribbled at the bottom. I haven't written back. Not yet. I sit with the letter sometimes in the evening, hold it like something fragile, and think about what it means to be remembered by someone you never met. I think about Ellen and how she would have smiled at the thought of a grandchild reaching out across the silence. Maybe I'll write back tomorrow, maybe next week. Or maybe I'll leave the letter tucked inside her favorite cookbook, a quiet message to the universe that even after all the betrayal, some things remain untouched. I haven't changed much in the house. Her chair is still in the den, her teacup still sits by the sink. I know it's not healthy, this clinging to echoes, but I've earned the right to live among my memories. I make small improvements where I can. Fixed the porch rail, replaced the roof tiles that winter peeled loose, had the heating checked before the cold came. Life now moves slowly, but with purpose. I eat well enough. I sleep a little better. The nightmares about Charles come less often, and when they do, they no longer end in anger, just a kind of weary disbelief. I think often about the day at the graveside, the whisper, the smirk, the quiet malice in his voice when he said, "You're next." He meant it as a warning, maybe even a threat. But now, those words have changed meaning. I am next. Not for death, not for defeat, but for peace, for dignity, For whatever years I have left to be mine alone, unclaimed, unmanipulated, I am next to live without fear that someone I love will hollow me out for gain. I am next to remember who I was before I became an obstacle. Sometimes I sit on the back steps at dusk, watch the sky melt from gold to blue, and I think about legacy. Not what you leave behind in money or titles or land, but what you resist. What you refuse to surrender. My legacy is this house, this land, and the fact that I stayed standing when the world tried to fold me up and file me away. I may not be remembered in any books, but I will be remembered by the soil, by the quiet, by the stubborn refusal to become invisible. That, in the end, is enough.